Hello everyone and welcome back to Horror Stories. I know many of you use these episodes to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Story 1. I was 15 when it happened, and back then my cousin Mateo was, to me, the kind of man who seemed to have stepped out of some borderland legend. He lived in a rough stretch of the southern Chihuahua Mountains, where my family had spent generations among dirt tracks, dry hills, and ravines cut by streams that almost never carried water. Mateo was tough, quiet, with a white scar running across one knuckle where part of his ring finger was missing. He always carried a long machete, an old carbine, and the confidence of someone who had walked the same mountain so many times he no longer had to think in order to find his way. People from the nearby ranches lowered their voices whenever the subject of the women who wandered the hills came up. They never named them directly. They said they worked for dangerous men, that they traded in dark favors, that they could make someone sick without ever touching them. My great-grandmother had a habit of hanging 2 cross pins behind the main entrance, convinced that nothing evil could cross the threshold that way. That hot season, Mateo decided to take me on a nighttime rabbit hunt. The walk stretched much longer than I expected, almost the entire night. We also brought the 2 dogs, Bronze and Sultan, both old shepherds but still strong. The night was so clear it looked as if it had been washed in milk. The full moon lit up the stone, the brush, the changes in the ground, even the short shadows of the cacti. We were heading toward an abandoned mining excavation, an old hollow in the mountain surrounded by stories from before I was even born. Along the way, Mateo joked that if a fox crossed our path, he would cut off its tail and tie it to his belt so all the girls at the fair would go crazy for him. I laughed because he always talked that way when he wanted to make something feel lighter. I never imagined that before dawn, that same night would split him open inside until he became unrecognizable. We left just as the sun had finished sinking and the air was beginning to cool. According to him, it was the best time because the small animals started moving as soon as the heat stopped beating down so hard on the rocks. We drove in an old truck until the road turned into nothing but a series of deep ruts and sharp stones. Once the vehicle could no longer move forward without getting stuck or breaking something, we hid it beside a cluster of mesquite trees and kept going on foot. Mateo handed me a slingshot and a small cloth bag filled with metal pellets. He said he was not going to waste bullets on animals that small, and besides, the noise of the gun would scare off anything nearby. Bronze walked close to us, serious and alert, without needing to be told anything. Sultan, on the other hand, came and went in wide circles, moving several yards away and returning as if he were counting us to make sure we were still all there. Mateo carried the carbine with the barrel pointed downward and the machete angled at his waist so the handle would not get in his way when climbing. As we moved, he pointed out things in the terrain so I would remember the way back. A dry trunk split in 2 like a slingshot fork, a large rock shaped like a turtle's head, a sagging section of barbed wire, the remains of a cattle trough. He did it naturally, as if he were teaching me how to read. He kept making jokes about foxes and women, but I already knew that habit of his. He did it to release tension. In truth, he never stopped looking. His eyes swept the hills, the cuts in the ground, and the dry creek beds with a slow precision. If anything bigger than a rabbit moved nearby, we left. That was one rule nobody argued with. Before I tell the rest, there is something important. Mateo was not a superstitious man. He mocked almost all of those stories. He said the charms people kept in their homes did more to calm old folks than to scare away anything real, and that many of the so-called cleansings were nothing more than a way to take people's money. Even so, there were certain places he did not like, especially places where people left strange things behind. On a high patch above the mine cut, we found a blackened piece of ground with remnants of melted candle wax, and a small bundle of bones tied together with a crimson cord. Mateo nudged it with the tip of his boot and muttered something dismissive about boys trying to scare each other. He said it as if he wanted to close the matter, but his face did not match his tone. By midnight, hardly any rabbits were coming out. The conversation had faded on its own, just like the lightness we had started with. The moonlight was so strong that we decided to switch off the helmet lamps, though that pale light had a strange effect. It flattened distances, made a rock look like an animal, and sent sounds drifting from one place to another. We went down through a shallow wash and then climbed toward a formation of jagged boulders. From there, we could see the entrance to the mine, a black mouth opening in the hillside beside a collapsed fence that formed a kind of broken angle. Bront stopped still, breathing tight, staring toward that dark opening. Sultan tore up a little grass with his teeth, chewed it for a second, and spat it out immediately, as if the taste had offended him. Around 3 a.m, we reached the mine area itself. At that moment, a huge owl with almost white feathers crossed over us so low that I could hear the wind beneath its wings. Mateo let out a nervous laugh and said there was one of those old hill women out looking for customers. But Sultan reacted in a way I had never seen before. He did not bark. He began to make a tight, low growl so full of hatred that it made my arms go cold. Bronze, who had been nearby only seconds earlier, suddenly bolted toward the entrance of the shaft and disappeared from sight. I told Mateo I could look inside to see whether the main tunnel was flooded while he circled the area looking for the dog. I went in with my flashlight on, and from the very first step, a silence hit me that did not belong to a normal place. In other old mines, there were always clicks, wings, bats, or at least the echo of dripping water. Not there, only my breathing. The main tunnel was partially flooded, maybe up to a quarter of its depth. The light began to weaken far too soon, which made no sense because I had checked the batteries myself that afternoon. I had not gone far enough for that to happen. I stopped, turned around to head back, and that was when it happened. I froze completely, but I kept hearing behind me the sound of wet footsteps. They were coming from a side passage. They were exactly like mine. I stood motionless. I lifted my right foot slightly and set it down slowly so I could hear the faint scrape of the sole against the damp ground. I waited. Half a second later, from the tunnel on the left came another faint scrape that copied mine with unbearable precision. My throat tightened. Even so, I called out, asking if anyone was there. I thought maybe someone used those passages as a shortcut, or maybe some drunk had gone into sleep and I did not want to scare him. No one answered. The only thing I heard was a slight splash, like the tip of a shoe brushing the water without fully stepping into it. The flashlight shrank even more, reduced to a weak, narrow beam. I forced myself to think it could be Bronze, that the echo twisted everything in there, that fear was making me imagine things. I took one step. Then I heard a voice say, "Sultan." It was not just the word. It was the way it sounded. It came out warped, almost playful, as if something that did not fully understand the language were testing my reaction. I raised the beam toward where the sound had come from and managed to see a tall silhouette. It moved in jerks, out of rhythm, with a smile far too wide for its face. The image lasted no more than a second, but I would swear its eyes were shining a dirty yellow. I acted on pure reflex. I hurled the slingshot at it with all the force I had. That thing let out a sharp shriek, like brakes grinding against metal, and I ran for the outside without thinking of anything else. When I got out, Sultan was planted in front of the entrance, baring his teeth into the darkness of the tunnel. As soon as he saw me, he stuck to me and began running alongside me as I searched for Mateo. I went down too fast over loose gravel, slipped, nearly fell, and whistled the way Mateo had taught me to gather the dogs close to the body. Sultan stayed by my side, but he kept staring at the shaft, growling so low it sounded like the noise was rising straight from his chest. I started shouting Mateo's name. My voice bounced off the rocks and came back broken, multiplied. Then I heard a strange sound, something halfway between a badly spoken word and the drag of boots over rough dirt. I found him a few yards away, kneeling on the ground, crying over Bronze's body. A knife was buried in the dog's side. Mateo said he had found him like that, but his voice was shaking so badly I could barely understand him. The dog lay on its side with the handle sunk in behind the shoulder. The skin around it was black, wet, stuck to itself. Mateo had one hand pressed over Bronze's ribs, as if he still expected to feel breathing. He touched the knife handle and jerked his hand back immediately, as if the metal had burned him. Sultan came closer, sniffed Bronze's neck, then planted himself again, staring toward the mine. I told Mateo not to touch anything, though deep down I knew my words were useless. He wiped his face with his sleeve, stood up, and slowly turned with the carbine half raised, like a man expecting someone to step out from any shadow. I blurted out what had happened inside, the voice, the dog's name, the figure moving in that impossible way. He looked at me for a moment with a hard expression, wanting to believe I was messing with him. And the moment he understood I was not, his face went dry from the inside. "We're leaving." He said it without raising his voice, but with a firmness that chilled me more than any shout could have. He worked the bolt of the gun just to hear the sound of the metal and took the lead. I clipped Sultan's leash on, though the dog kept pulling toward the hill as if he wanted to run in 3 directions at once. Instead of going back by the easy route, we took a more direct cut toward where we had left the truck, crossing a slope of loose rock that gave way beneath our boots. Mateo kept telling me where to place each foot, almost in a whisper, without ever stopping his scan of the ridges, hollows, and every place someone might be hiding. I could not stop looking back. The image of that smile inside the mine stayed stuck in my eyes, and the worst part was that every time I looked there was no movement at all. That emptiness was more unbearable than if I had actually seen something following us. On the opposite side of the hill, a low shape crouched for a second and then stayed still. Mateo spun immediately, aiming the carbine, and it melted into the brush so completely it seemed it had never been anything but dirt and shadow. The mine was being left behind us, but it did not feel far away. It was as if something from that place kept stretching toward us. Coyotes were howling from different hillsides. The sound drifted in and out with the wind, and even so I felt eyes tracking every step we took. Mateo moved Bronze's body toward a natural crack between the rocks just off the path. He did it with unbearable gentleness, as if he were laying down a sleeping child so he would not wake. Every few seconds he lifted his eyes over his shoulder, watching the bushes, the edge of the mine, the collapsed fence. He did not try to pull out the knife. He only straightened the dog's ears, removed his collar, and kept it. Then he said something in a very low voice, old words I could not understand, and stood there looking at the hillside as if he expected an answer. In the end, he nodded once into the empty air. "Now." Sultan whimpered and took a step back. We kept walking without speaking. The dog's nails clicked against the smooth rock, then vanished when they hit soft sand. Every time he stopped, I stopped too. That was another one of those rules already living inside me. Mateo kept turning constantly to cover our rear, moving with the tension of someone who believed he was in the middle of an ambush. I did not tell him everything I had seen inside the tunnel. I also did not ask who had driven the knife into Bronze's side. The entire way back, I felt that something was moving with us from the darkness between the hills, matching the rhythm of our boots. Twice we heard stones breaking loose and rolling down the slope, small rock slides that did not seem to come from animals. Sultan's entire spine bristled, but whenever we turned, there was nothing there. No fleeing shadow, no breath, no crack of branches, nothing. When we reached the truck, Mateo did not open it right away. First, he walked all the way around it, checked the tires, ran his hand over the body, looked into the bed, crouched to check underneath, and only then opened the driver's door. He set the gun on the seat and stood still for a second with both hands on the steering wheel without starting the engine yet. Then he said one word, "Seatbelt." I put it on immediately. He never repeated an order. When we started driving out along the dirt track, the exhaust pipe scraped the ground, and I braced a hand against the dashboard so I would not slam into anything. Sultan lay on the floor of the cab, trembling each time the headlights swept across a post, a fence, or a bush that I would have sworn had not been there a second earlier. Then at last we crossed the ranch gate and everything went silent. We arrived at dawn. Mateo parked badly, crooked, and went straight into his room without saying a single word. He shut the door and I heard the lock turn. I poured water for Sultan. He drank so desperately that he coughed, then sat there staring down the hallway as if he were waiting for Mateo to come out and give an order. From the kitchen, my great-grandmother asked why we had come back so early. I told her we had not found anything. She stood still with a dishcloth in her hands, then asked where Bronze was. I told her we had lost him in the hills. She held my gaze for a moment. Her face shifted just slightly, as if she understood I was lying but did not want to open that door yet. I looked away first. Mateo did not come out of his room for several days. We left a plate of food by the door. Once I heard the sound of a fork scraping something, and after that, nothing. At night, Sultan stood in the hallway staring into the darkness inside the house and growled at nothing, as if that nothing were pacing from one side to the other behind the walls. Sometimes he would look back at me over his shoulder with a strange expression, almost annoyed, as if I were getting in the way between him and something I could not perceive. That was the last time I saw in Mateo the solid man I admired. Whatever came back with us from that mountain range did not attack him all at once. It worked its way into him slowly. A year later, I went back to visit the family and I barely recognized him. He had become the shame of the town, one of those thin, unsteady men who start asking for alcohol early in the day. He had been reduced to bone and skin, his mouth ruined, his teeth loose at first, and then disappearing one by one. He trembled even when he was sitting down. The people who had once respected him no longer even looked him in the eye. His own brothers began keeping him away from the workshop, as if they feared his mere presence would contaminate the place. He spent hours wandering near the store, asking for change for beer in a worn-out voice that did not fit his face. Sometimes he would slip a hand into his pocket, touch Bronze's collar, and go still. Then he seemed to forget what he had been looking for. No one could mention the mine in front of him. The moment anyone even hinted at the subject, he lowered his eyes and changed the conversation with miserable urgency. In the family, all kinds of things were whispered. That the women of the hills had gotten to him. That something old from those mountains had latched onto him. That he had come back marked and was still paying for having gone where he should not have gone. The men from the ranches spoke of a presence in that area by different names. Something that does not kill quickly but steals a man's strength, his will, even the weight of his own name until only the shell is left behind. I do not know which of all those versions was true. The only thing I know is that what found him that night did not wound him on the outside. It hollowed him out. I never told anyone that the thing inside the tunnel had spoken Sultan's name. To this day, I am convinced Mateo saw something worse than what I managed to glimpse in that darkness. I have never set foot on those hills again since then. There are places that seem to keep a part of whoever enters them, and that mine was not satisfied with a part. It took everything that made Mateo the man he was, and left behind only a hollow figure breathing out of habit. Story 2. I grew up in a tiny community in eastern Pennsylvania, very close to where the borders of New Jersey and Delaware met. It was an old place, one of those towns burdened with too many years and too many stories. It had been founded centuries earlier, back when people were still settling the banks of the Delaware River. And according to the old-timers, in those early days many people disappeared or drowned whenever the river became enraged and overflowed out of control. Because of that, over time, the woods surrounding the river began to take on a strange reputation. Some people swore that the forest was not as still or empty as it seemed, that something had remained among the trees for longer than the town itself had existed. It was summer, and because I had always suffered from endless nights and restless sleep, I loved vacation because no one could force me to go to bed early. Even so, what happened took place on a night when I had been strictly forbidden to go outside. I had been awake for hours. I had already come home, gotten into bed, and turned over again and again without managing to fall asleep. After spending a long time staring into the darkness above me, I finally gave up. It must have been close to 3 in the morning when I decided to sneak out and walk through the woods for a while to clear my head. Up until then, I had already had my own scares and strange experiences, but nothing out of the ordinary had ever happened to me in that place. It was somewhere I knew well, and because of that, I had no real reason to distrust it. I went out through the back of the house, walked down the street in silence, crossed the railroad tracks, and entered the trees. There were plenty of reasons why a 15-year-old girl should not have been out there alone at that hour. Addicts, drifters, and all kinds of people you did not want to run into at night were known to pass through those trails. But I was reckless as well as stubborn, and I never got scared as easily as I should have. In the pocket of my hoodie, I had my usual pocket knife, my phone to use as a light when needed, and my music player, because I loved walking while listening to songs whenever I could not sleep. I kept moving just off the main path with my hood up, trying not to be noticed in case someone else was out there. No one had ever bothered me before, so I did not expect that night to be any different. I headed toward a section of the woods I usually pass through during the day, though I had never gone there at that hour. There was a small clearing with the remains of the foundation of an old structure that I had always imagined had once been a house. Near the foundation was a wide fallen log where I sometimes sat. The moment I crossed into that area, I felt something strange. It was not the same place I knew in daylight. The air felt different, thick, as if it had filled with the presence of someone else. I took one earbud out without stopping and kept walking slowly. I would not say I was terrified yet. At that moment, I felt more curiosity than fear. But whatever was there with me did not feel normal. I thought maybe it was some kind of animal, and that could definitely be a problem. Even so, I needed to know what it was. I moved carefully to the edge of the clearing and looked between the trees. What I saw hollowed out my chest in an instant. There was a figure moving near the ruins. For a moment, I thought it was a person crouched down, maybe someone moving on all fours. But it took only another second to realize it did not move like a human being. Every motion was violent, jerky, wrong. Its body seemed put together in a way that did not match anything I had ever seen before. Its legs were far too long and reminded me of the legs of a skinny dog, though they still retained something disturbingly human. Its arms were also unnaturally long, ending in hands with impossible fingers, bony like pale claws. Its skin had a grayish tone, almost colorless, like flesh that had never seen sunlight. It was incredibly thin. Its bones showed beneath the skin in a way that was almost obscene, and even so, it did not seem fragile. On the contrary, there was something in that thinness that suggested pure strength, as if it could break me effortlessly the moment it reached me. I watched it circling the remains of the structure, as if it were searching through the area for something. Then I noticed a backpack lying near the foundation. It had been torn apart. In the faint moonlight filtering through the branches, I could make out dark stains that looked like blood. My first thought was that the thing had not noticed me yet. Its face was turned toward the other side of the clearing, and that gave me the slightest feeling of relief, because the last thing I wanted was for it to turn and catch me watching it. Whatever it was, it brought nothing good with it. So I began stepping backward very slowly, trying not to make a sound. Then a faint breeze blew from behind me. The creature froze instantly. It was not a normal pause. It stopped in a total unnatural way, as if it had turned into a statue. It seemed to be smelling the air. I kept backing away, step by step, not daring to look away. Slowly, it began turning its head toward where I was standing, and when I finally saw its face clearly, something inside me broke. At first glance, it had almost human features, but everything was out of proportion. The jaw was too wide, too strong, as if it had been built for crushing. Its lips were extremely thin, stretched tight, and they revealed crooked, sharp teeth that still somehow looked disturbingly human. But the worst part was the eyes. They were larger than normal and completely black. Not dark, not deep brown, but absolute black. A blackness that seemed to swallow light itself. There was something in that stare unlike anything I had ever seen. It was hunger, but not ordinary animal hunger. It was a sick, desperate need, a kind of emptiness that seemed to want to devour any living thing that came within its reach. I could not scream. I could barely breathe. Then the thing let out a low, rough growl, as if it were rising from deep inside a rotten chest. The sound grew gradually louder, changing. tearing itself apart until it became an impossible shriek. It did not sound like any animal I had ever known. It did not sound human either. It was a high, deranged scream that tore through my ears and shook me from the inside. I had never heard anything like it before, and I have never heard anything like it since. That was enough. I turned and ran for the trail as fast as I could. Back then, I was training in track and distance running. When adrenaline hit, I could move very fast. I did not look back even once, because I knew with irrational certainty that if I did, that thing would catch me. Behind me, I could hear it crashing through branches, slamming into tree trunks, throwing itself through the woods with violence. From the sound, I understood it was moving on 4 limbs. I was barely managing to stay ahead of it. I crossed the last line of trees, burst out onto the trail, and slammed straight into someone. It was a man. He had a long, unkempt brown beard, a filthy red cap, and the unmistakable smell of someone who had been living outside for a long time. He immediately started asking me, in a rush, if I was okay, what had happened, why I was running like that. But before I could answer, he lifted his eyes over my shoulder. I remember perfectly how the color drained from his face. At that exact moment, I felt a brutal burning slash across my back. I screamed and fell forward. The man shouted too, and then the creature shifted its attention away from me and focused on him. I used that single second of distraction as best I could. I got to my feet, barely steady, and ran again. I could still hear the man shouting behind me, but I no longer heard the thing chasing me directly, so I did not stop. I refused to look back. I ran the entire way home, more than a kilometer without slowing down. I got inside, slammed the door shut, and locked every lock. Then I went through the whole house checking windows and entrances, making sure everything was tightly closed. When I finished, I went up to my room, got under the blankets, and started crying. I could not stop asking myself what the hell that thing had been and what might have happened to the man. At some point, I finally fell asleep, not because I felt calm, but from pure exhaustion. The next morning, I woke up because of the pain. My back burned as if someone had dragged hot metal across it. I took off my hoodie and shirt and saw that both had been torn open across the back, completely ripped in 4 long lines. My phone was gone. So was the pocket knife. So was the music player. I assumed they had fallen out while I was running like mad through the trees. I went to the bathroom and examined myself in the mirror with my whole body shaking. I had 4 deep grooves crossing my back. They were red, swollen, and edged with dried blood. I cleaned myself up as best I could, threw away the ruined clothes, and tried to act as if nothing had happened, even though every movement reminded me that it absolutely had. A few days later, I saw the story in the local newspaper. The police had found a man who matched the description of the drifter I had collided with on the trail. The article said he had been attacked, apparently by a wild dog. He was still breathing when they found him, but he had been rushed to the hospital in critical condition. What stayed with me most was another line in the article. It mentioned that he was receiving treatment for some unknown mental disorder, and parents were being urged to keep a closer watch on their children. To this day, I can only imagine what he told them for them to decide to print something like that. I never found out what happened to him afterward. The guilt stayed with me for a long time. I still feel it sometimes. I cannot stop thinking that I was the one who led that thing to him, that I ran into him at the worst possible moment and then left him behind to save myself. But there is a part of me, a cold and honest part, that knows perfectly well that if I had not run into that man that night, I would not have made it home alive. For years, I did not go back into those woods, not even during the day. I stayed away from them as if simply looking at the tree line might call something back. Eventually, I ended up moving to the opposite side of the country. Over time, I told the story to a few friends. Many of them laughed. Others pretended to believe me just to avoid arguing. When I tried to describe what I saw, I sometimes used the word ghoul because I could not find anything closer to that image. Later, over the years, I started hearing stories about similar beings and came to think that maybe I had come face to face with something others would call a Wendigo. I cannot say for sure, In truth, I do not even want to. Part of me hopes I never find out what it really was. The only thing I do know is that thing, the shriek it let out, the man's screams behind me, all of it still forces its way into my dreams. Even now, after so many years, I have never been able to forget it, and I know I never will. Story 3. This happened more than 2 decades ago, in the final cold days of 1994, when autumn was already dying and winter was starting to make itself felt in the air. I was 12 years old, and that night I had been at a neighbor's house until fairly late, probably close to 10:30. When I finally left, I started back home alone, just as I had done other times before, using the shortcut path that cut through a stretch of woods between his street and mine. It was the fastest way, and I knew it by heart, so I did not think much about it when I stepped in among the trees. The night was completely dark, and the woods had that strange stillness that sometimes only appears when everything feels too motionless. I was lighting my way with a small flashlight, moving through the shadows, when suddenly I heard a sound that made me stop dead in my tracks. It was not just any growl or the noise of some ordinary animal. It was a kind of deep, heavy bellow, something between a roar and the burst of an enormous throat. The shock made me react so fast that the flashlight slipped from my hand and fell to the ground. I turned immediately, trying to figure out where that sound had come from. I stared into the darkness, straining my eyes, but I could not make out anything. Only trees, black trunks, and still branches. For a few seconds, I tried to convince myself that I had imagined the noise, or that it had been some smaller animal whose sound had been distorted by the woods. I kept telling myself there was nothing there, that I was scaring myself for no reason. Then I bent down to pick up the flashlight. At that exact moment, I heard the dry snap of a branch right in front of me. I jerked my head up and saw it. At first glance, it looked somewhat like a deer, or at least that was the first thought that crossed my mind. But right away, I knew it was not a normal animal. The shape of its legs was wrong. Not twisted the way an injured animal's legs might be, but bent in an unnatural, impossible way, as if its limbs had been assembled incorrectly. That posture made its silhouette deeply disturbing, almost human at moments, even though it still had something clearly beast-like about it. I cannot really explain what was worst: its shape, the way it occupied the space in front of me, or the fact that it was standing there motionless, as if it had already been watching me for some time. Fear threw me backward before I could even think. I fell to the ground and immediately tried to get back up however I could, driven by pure instinct. I did not stay to look a second time. I ran into the trees without direction, without thought, blinded by terror. I could barely see where I was going. I only wanted to put as much distance as possible between myself and that thing. Branches struck my face and arms as I ran blindly through the forest. At some point, I slammed straight into a tree. I do not remember the impact clearly. I only know that everything went black all at once. When I came to, I was lying flat on my back on the forest floor. It took me several seconds to understand where I was. My head was pounding with unbearable force, and my nose hurt in a sharp, constant way. I could feel blood running down my face from my broken nose. I blinked several times, disoriented, and finally raised my arm to look at my watch. It showed a little after midnight. Quite a bit of time had passed since I had started running, though I had no way of knowing exactly how much. I stayed there for a few moments, trying to gather my strength. Then I looked around. Everything was still dark. I could not see anything that told me which direction I should go, and I no longer had the flashlight. Even so, I managed to get to my feet with a great deal of effort. I felt dazed, dizzy, and weak, but I knew I could not stay there on the ground. So I started walking. I spent the rest of the night stumbling through the woods in the dark, with no light, no sense of direction, and my body completely battered. Every step was slow, clumsy, and painful. I kept moving only because stopping felt worse. I do not know how many times I tripped or how many times I thought I would never find my way out. Time became strange in there. Everything was darkness, cold, and trees. I never saw that thing again. But I could not forget the image of its deformed body standing in front of me. Finally, when dawn began to break and the light slowly filtered through the branches, the forest stopped being a black mass and started looking like a real place again. With the morning light, I was able to get my bearings better and kept walking until I finally came out onto the road. When I recognized the streets of my neighborhood, I felt such enormous relief that I nearly collapsed right there. I managed to stagger all the way to my front door, but the moment I got there, the exhaustion and pain overtook me completely, and I collapsed. The next time I opened my eyes, I was no longer at home. I was in a hospital bed. Later, they explained to me that my arm was fractured, in addition to the blows to my head and my badly smashed nose. Even so, they let me go home the following day. And that is essentially everything that happened. It is not a long story, but it is one of those experiences that stays lodged inside you forever. I never knew for certain what it was that I saw that night among the trees. Over the years, I have tried to give it a logical explanation, but none of them ever fully fit. Now that I am a father and have children of my own, I never take that kind of thing lightly. I always make sure that if they have to come home after dark, they do not do it alone. They go with friends or with an adult, because there are things out there that a person does not understand, whether they exist only in the stories people tell or not. And when it comes to something like that, I would much rather seem overly cautious than let my guard down. Story 4. Several years ago, I was given a few days off from work, and since I had no plans, I decided to do something completely different from what I was used to. I came up with the idea of spending a night outdoors in a fairly well-known forest reserve a few hours from where I lived. The place was popular with hikers, people who rode mountain bikes along the trails, and campers who stayed there regularly. Online, it had excellent reviews and photos that made it look peaceful, clean, and perfect for someone wanting to unplug for a while. I, on the other hand, had grown up in a huge city, surrounded by noise, buildings, traffic, and concrete. I had almost no contact with nature, and even less real experience in wooded places. That was exactly why I thought maybe it was the perfect time to try something new and find out what it felt like to sleep out in the middle of the woods. I called my friend Ryan, who was one of those people who always seemed more comfortable outdoors than at home. He loved campers, road trips, campfires, and anything that involved spending time away from the city. For years, he had tried to convince me to join him on one of his outings, but I always had work, obligations, or some other excuse not to go. So when I called to ask if he could lend me some of his gear, he could barely believe it. He got excited right away and said, of course. Unfortunately, he was already out of town at the time and could not hand the gear to me in person, so I had to stop by his apartment and pick it up myself. After loading the car with water, junk food, a few supplies, and the basic equipment he had left ready for me, I left the city and got on the highway. The drive lasted a couple of hours. There was some traffic getting out of town as usual, but nothing too bad. Little by little, the buildings fell away behind me and the landscape changed until it became more open, greener, emptier. When I finally reached the forest area and parked in the designated lot, the first thing that hit me was the smell. The air was clean, damp, fresh in a way you never feel in the city. Everything around me was beautiful. There were tall trees, clearly marked dirt trails, and that kind of silence that at first seems pleasant until you realize how strange it feels when you are not used to it. I took what I needed out of the trunk and started walking down a short trail. That specific part of the park was meant for campers, and anyone could arrive, choose an open spot, and set up a tent there. I walked for several minutes until I found a place that seemed right. It was a flat area with no one around, but it also was not too far from the parking lot. I liked it because it was secluded enough to make me feel like I was truly out in the woods, alone and surrounded by trees, but still close enough to the car in case something went wrong. I pitched the tent, arranged the things I had brought, and once it was fully dark, I climbed inside and tried to rest. I lay there listening to the faint brush of the tent fabric in the breeze and trying to relax. From the beginning, something felt off. It was not a specific sound or some strange sight between the trees. It was more like a feeling, an internal insistence I could not shake. I had the constant impression that something outside knew exactly where I was and was watching me. I tried not to pay attention to it. I told myself it had to be normal. I have always been a somewhat anxious person, and besides, it was the first time in my life I had ever slept alone in a forest. I did not consider myself especially cowardly, but no matter how many times I closed my eyes and tried to stay still, my whole body reacted as if I were trapped in a real danger situation. It was as if some older, more instinctive part of me were trying to warn me to get out of there as fast as possible. But at the same time, I kept asking myself what exactly I was supposed to be running from. There was nothing there, or at least nothing visible. Another hour passed and I was still awake, checking my phone over and over, rolling around in the sleeping bag without being able to fall asleep. I turned onto one side, then onto my back, then onto the other side, but the unease would not go away. Finally, I decided to step outside for a moment to get some air and see if that helped calm me down. I unzipped the tent and stretched outside. The forest was completely silent. I did not see any movement. I did not hear anything strange. Everything looked normal. I felt a little ridiculous and figured it was probably just beginner nerves, the result of being alone in the middle of an unfamiliar place. I even tried doing some breathing exercises I had learned from internet videos, inhaling slowly and exhaling calmly. But the minutes kept passing and the feeling remained lodged in my body. After a while, I decided there was no point in forcing it anymore. I thought maybe I would sleep better in the car. I left most of my things in the tent, took only what I absolutely needed, and started walking back along the trail toward the parking lot. I had gone only a few yards, maybe 6 or 7, when I clearly heard the sound of a dry branch snapping. It came from my left, some distance away, maybe about 15 yards into the trees. It did not sound like a small twig falling on its own or something light brushing the ground. It sounded like something heavy had stepped directly onto it. At that moment, every bad feeling I had had since lying down in the tent was confirmed. Fear hit me instantly. My chest tightened, my arms stiffened, and my heart pounded so hard it felt like it was trying to break out of me. I stood still and shined my light toward where the snap had come from, trying to figure out whether it was a person, an animal, or something my mind was exaggerating. But the darkness was too thick, and the flashlight barely reached enough to illuminate a few nearby trunks. I tried to raise my voice and yell something in a firm tone, hoping to scare off whatever was there. I told myself maybe it was just some large animal moving through the woods. I also tried to convince myself that maybe it had simply been a branch breaking on its own under the weight of the dampness. But no, I knew what I had heard. It had been a footstep. Something had been there with me, and I no longer wanted to keep finding out what it was. I decided not to take the risk and ran for the car. I had barely gone a few yards when I heard movement through the trees again. This time there was no doubt. Something was coming after me. It was moving fast, absurdly fast. Faster than I would have imagined possible for a person moving through the woods at night. For part of the run, it kept pace with me parallel to the trail, moving closer and farther through the undergrowth. Then suddenly I stopped hearing it. I had no idea why it had gone quiet or whether it had actually gone away. I did not stop to find out. I kept running until I reached the car, drenched in cold sweat, gasping, and with my mind completely clouded by fear. The small parking lot was still full of vehicles, which normally would have given me some comfort. Yet there was not a single person in sight. No flashlights on, no conversation, no doors opening. Everything was empty. I got into the car immediately and locked the doors. Whatever had followed me, at least now I was shut inside behind metal and glass. That made me feel a little safer. I sat still, listening, waiting to hear something else. I hoped it had not come out of the woods. Nearly an hour passed without me daring to try to sleep. It must have been around 3 or maybe 4 in the morning by then. I was exhausted physically and mentally. Little by little, I started nodding off, exactly what I had been trying to avoid. To make things worse, it began to rain, and the air inside the car grew heavy and hot, so I cracked the window slightly to let in some fresh air. The sound of the rain on the roof had a strangely relaxing effect. For a moment, I thought maybe everything from earlier was over, that all I had to do was wait until sunrise and leave. That was when I heard a scratching sound against the body of the car. It was not a hard impact. It was a slow, deliberate sound like nails or something sharp dragging itself along the side of the vehicle. I sat upright instantly and looked around, but outside I could see absolutely nothing. Everything was black. I did not want to turn on the flashlight or make any movement that might reveal my position more clearly, especially if it was a bear or some other large animal. I waited several minutes without hearing anything else. Then very cautiously I leaned a little toward the opening in the window. Since I still could not make anything out, I ended up hitting the car horn, thinking the noise would scare off whatever was nearby. The sound echoed across the parking lot and disappeared into the wet forest. After another minute, I stopped honking. I thought the noise surely would have scared it away. At that point, I no longer cared about sleeping or waiting for sunrise. I just wanted to leave. I decided I would drive to some open parking lot in a nearby town, maybe a large store or a gas station, and figure out from there whether I would return home at first light. I started the engine, turned on the headlights, and switched on the windshield wipers. And then I saw him. About 12 yards in front of the vehicle stood a man, or at least that was what he looked like at first glance. He was tall, solidly built, with a thick neck, and such a compact, brutal body structure that he seemed more like a fighting animal than a person. His face was marked with scars, the skin warped in several places, and there was something deeply wrong about his posture. He was not standing still in any normal way. He swayed slightly like he was holding himself back. Saliva hung from his mouth and kept dripping down. The moment I saw him, I let out a strangled breath and gripped the steering wheel so hard my hands hurt. What happened next was worse. The man dropped down onto all fours. He did not do it like someone stumbling. He did it naturally, as if that were his usual way of moving. He began coming sideways toward the car in quick animal-like motions, and then I saw a glint in one of his hands. It looked like a knife. I did not wait another second. I threw the car into gear immediately and jerked hard toward the lot exit. As I maneuvered, I caught sight of him still chasing me on all fours with a speed that should not have been possible. He was not wearing any clothes, and the more I looked at him, the less he seemed like a man, and the more he looked like some wild creature barely disguised as human. Even though I was already inside the car, for a moment I had the horrible feeling that he was almost going to catch me. Luckily, I managed to get out of the parking lot and onto the road. I did not slow down until I was far away from there. I was left so shaken, so deeply disturbed by what had happened, that I never went back for the rest of my things. Everything I had left in the tent stayed there. Later, I had to pay Ryan a considerable amount for the lost gear, because it was only fair, even though it hurt. A few days later, driven more by disbelief than bravery, I went back to the place during the day to see whether anything was still there. But everything was gone. There was no sign of my tent or any of the rest of the equipment. Even now, I still get chills thinking that this person may have been watching me for hours. He could have stayed hidden among the trees while I was trying to sleep, staring at me from the darkness while I had no idea at all. I reported what happened to the police the next day, and I have always wanted to believe they found him before he did something to someone else. That probably is not what a normal camping experience looks like, but it did make one thing very clear to me. Anyone who decides to spend the night in a place like that needs to stay aware of their surroundings and have some way to protect themselves, especially if they are alone. That does not mean I will never try camping again, but that night turned a simple trip into the woods into something so strange, so brutal, and so unreal that even now it is hard to think about it without feeling like something is creeping back toward me from the darkness. Story 5. This happened quite a few years ago, when I was a 9-year-old child and my half-brother, who was only a little older than me, was 10. My mother had just rebuilt her life with her new partner, and at that time we were still getting used to all living under the same roof. One early morning they were not home, and my stepbrother and I were left alone from very early on, shortly before it was fully daylight. It must have been around 5:30. We were in the living room trying to watch a show, but the connection kept buffering and the image froze every few seconds. Since we were two kids with no patience and far too much energy to sit still, we gave up on waiting and decided to go out into the yard to practice with the bow, something we did pretty often when there were no adults watching us. Outside, the grass was soaked with dew, and the air had that damp chill you feel just before the sun fully rises. The light was still weak, grayish, and everything seemed half asleep. It took us a few minutes to walk to the area where we usually set up the target. It was a secluded spot, far enough from the house to make us feel alone, but still familiar to us. We set up the target and started taking turns as usual. At first, everything seemed normal. We fired a few arrows and laughed with each other, competing to see who could hit more accurately. But after a while, I noticed that something in my stepbrother's attitude had changed. I could not explain exactly what came first, whether it was the way he was looking around or the sudden silence that seemed to fall over him. I only know that he went from being excited to acting strangely, tense, as if he had heard something I had not. We did another round of shots, and when it was his turn again, he stood still with a strange paleness in his face. In a low voice that did not sound like his, he told me he was going to skip that turn. That confused me, because only a few minutes earlier, he had been the one insisting the most that we go outside. Even so, I did not think too much about it and kept shooting a couple more arrows. Then, while I was getting ready to aim again, he grabbed my arm roughly. At first, he did not say anything. He only pointed. I looked toward where he was indicating, toward an old mound of blackened debris and burned trash that was pretty far away, almost at the edge of the property. And the moment I focused my eyes properly, I felt an icy jolt move through my whole body. Barely peeking out from behind that pile was a face. It was not just a pale face. It was a white face, motionless, expressionless, so drained of color that it did not seem to belong to anything alive. It showed only enough of itself for us to see it, as if whatever was hiding there was in no hurry to reveal itself completely. We froze. My stepbrother and I did not say a word. The thing did not move either. It just stayed there, half hidden, watching us. I remember that stillness as something unbearable. It was as if time had stopped all around us. The three of us held each other's gaze for what feels very long in my memory, though maybe it was only a couple of minutes. No one was breathing normally. No one dared to break that moment. I could feel my legs shaking, but I could not run. There was something in that face that kept me nailed to the ground, something empty and at the same time alert, as if it had not yet decided whether to run away or come closer. Then my stepbrother took an awkward step backward. His shoe came down on a dry twig, which snapped with a loud crack in the middle of that silence. The sound seemed to spread in an absurd way, as if it had echoed across the whole yard. And that was what broke the spell. The creature reacted instantly. It let out a scream so brutal that even now I struggle to find words for it. It did not sound human. It did not sound entirely animal either. It was a torn, savage cry, as if it blended the scream of a feline with the sharp wail of a nocturnal bird. It sounded like pain and fury at the same time, and it cut through me in a way I have never been able to forget. The moment we heard it, both of us took off running without thinking. I do not remember picking anything up. I do not remember looking back. I only remember the blind urge to get back to the house as fast as possible, with my heart pounding in my throat. We burst inside, slammed the door shut, and locked it. After that, we stayed inside, pressed close to the interior of the house, waiting for an adult to come back. I do not know how much time passed before that happened. I only know that neither of us wanted to go anywhere near the windows again, and that for the rest of that morning we could barely speak clearly. From that day on, we never went outside alone so casually again. What we saw that morning is still something I cannot explain. I do not know what it was or where it came from. The only thing I know for certain is that the terror I felt while staring at that face behind the ash pile was different from any other fear I have ever known in my life. Story 6. I have spent more than 3 decades venturing into remote places, usually crossing the vast expanse of the Quetico forest, and then losing myself in the uninhabited territories farther northwest. Over the years, those of us who are used to walking through those places come to understand that nature has very precise ways of announcing when it no longer wants you there. It rarely does so with anything dramatic. More often, it reveals itself through something barely noticeable: the sudden heaviness of the air, a strange shift in the light, or that uncomfortable instant when every sound in the wilderness stops at the same time, as if something had ordered silence. That late autumn, I was accompanied by my cousin Darian and our friend Lucia. We were heading toward an old backwoods cabin Darian had acquired after the liquidation of an abandoned property. It was an old structure, forgotten among fir trees and stone, hidden several miles beyond the last usable trail, farther than a logging settlement that had nearly been erased from the map. Each of us carried a heavy pack, around 40 pounds, loaded with wool blankets, cured meat, and several dry birch logs to supplement whatever firewood we could find and keep the stove burning. It was that part of the year when the ground turns rigid as metal and daylight feels worn down, more like a weak memory than a real presence. The first sign came around mid-afternoon on our first day. We were crossing a cedar bog locked in ice. Beneath our boots, the frozen surface complained with dry cracks. Without any warning, the temperature dropped all at once. It was not a gradual change or the normal arrival of a cold front. The wind did not rise, no new clouds formed, and there was no sound moving through the treetops. It was an empty kind of cold, abrupt, one that did not seem to descend from above but to rise straight out of the ground itself. Lucia stopped while adjusting the strap of her pack and slowly turned her head, scanning the surroundings. She worked in environmental studies, a methodical woman with no tendency towards superstition. But later she confessed that for a few seconds the landscape had looked to her like an old photograph from which all the color had been torn away. That was when we saw it. On a low fir branch there was a raven sitting motionless. Its eyes were still open, still glossy, but its body was stiff from head to tail, frozen in the same posture it had been in when it landed. It had not fallen and did not look like it had been attacked. Life had simply abandoned it while it remained balanced there. We reached the cabin just as the sun was slipping behind the dark line of trees. It was a solid structure built of thick logs, assembled by hand decades earlier, though it was obvious it had stood empty for a long time. The air inside smelled of stale dust and something metallic, like the trace left by a coin warm between your fingers. It took us almost an hour to get the stove truly going. Normally, when a stove finally starts to roar inside a house in the middle of the forest, you feel as though you have entered an unbreakable refuge. But that night the heat seemed to die only a few inches beyond the iron. The corners remained frozen, and the darkness collected in them felt thick, almost physical, as if it were not the absence of light but something else taking up space. We ate salt pork with barely a word between us. The only constant sound was the repetitive click of Darian's knife as he shaved curls from a piece of aromatic wood. Around 10 o'clock, the worst part came: absolute silence. Anyone who has spent nights deep in the wilderness knows there is never such a thing as complete silence out there. There is always something. Branches tightening under the frost, the brushing of treetops, some small animal scratching in the roof or the ground. But this was a different kind of void. It felt as though the cabin had been sealed inside a chamber where sound itself could not exist. Darian stopped moving in the middle of a gesture and lifted his head slightly, listening. He said nothing. He simply stretched out his hand toward his hunting rifle and settled it across his legs. I went to the window to pull the heavy curtain fully shut. Before I closed it, I looked out toward the clearing. The snow washed in moonlight lay untouched, and yet near the edge where the dark pines began, I saw something moving. It was not a moose or a bear or anything I recognized. It was a figure far too tall, close to 10 feet, and so thin it looked as if it had been drawn on the landscape with a single black line. It did not walk normally. It moved in jerks, and the way its limbs coordinated was wrong, more like the motion of an enormous insect than any living thing I knew. I did not tell the others. I closed the curtain, secured the door, and dropped the wooden bar into place with hands that were trying not to shake. The next morning was worse than the night. When we got up, we found that there were no tracks around the cabin. No human tracks, no animal tracks. That was what was disturbing. The total absence of marks. On the frost-covered windows were clear circles, as if something had pressed its face against the glass during the night. And still the snow on the porch and outside remained smooth, untouched. We decided to leave earlier than planned. The place was charged with too obvious a feeling of being watched, as if the entire forest had turned its attention onto us. But when we started packing, we discovered that Lucia's backpack was gone. We found it several minutes later, much deeper among the trees, hanging from a high branch well above any reasonable reach. It had not been thrown there at random. Someone or something had placed it there with calm precision. The straps were neatly looped around a branch no man could have reached without help. The entire forest seemed to lean in our direction. Every time I turned my head, I thought I caught, in the corner of my eye, a pale, unnaturally long shape sliding behind a trunk. By the time we were ready to leave, the afternoon had already collapsed into darkness. The temperature plunged again. The light was dying far too fast, and we were forced to admit the obvious. Crossing that stretch of forest at night, over ice and broken terrain, would be the same as courting death. We returned to the cabin with the intention of holding out until dawn, but the stove no longer worked the way it had before. Smoke pushed back into the room through the little stove door and hung inside the cabin like a funeral veil. That was when the voice began. It sounded exactly like Lucia. The problem was that Lucia was sitting right in front of me, her back against the wall, her lips parted, and her face as white as the snow outside. The voice was coming from the other side of the door, muffled by the wood, trembling, pleading. "It's so cold out here, Tomas," it said. "Please, I can't feel my hands. Let me in." Lucia dug her fingers into my forearm so hard it hurt. None of us spoke. We stayed on the floor pressed against one another, not daring to breathe normally. Then the voice changed. It shed every trace of anything feminine and became a dry, rough friction, like dead leaves being dragged across stone. It began speaking names we knew. It said my mother's name, though she had died many years earlier. It said the name of a man Darian had lost in the army. It spoke of hunger, but not ordinary hunger, the kind that food can satisfy. It spoke of an immense, endless need, an ancient voracity so deep you could imagine it swallowing forests, towns, and people without ever being filled. Close to midnight, the scratching began. It did not come from the door. It came from above. It was slow, deliberate, dragging, as if something hardened by time were scraping against the roof. We could hear the shingles and roof beams groan under a weight that sounded contradictory, enormous and yet strangely light, as if whatever was up there belonged to two different worlds at once. Then something happened that still wakes me in the night. Between two logs near the top of the wall, the tip of a finger appeared. It was long, grayish, tipped by a yellow nail, thin and sharp as a metal thorn. It was not a human finger. It had too many joints, too many segments. It did not try to touch anything inside. It simply stayed there, barely moving, testing the air like some kind of sensory organ. Darian was the first to break. He raised the rifle and fired upward. The blast inside that cramped space was brutal, but the answer we got was far worse. A shriek tore through the darkness, a high wavering sound that began with the shape of a human scream and ended as the fierce whistle of a blizzard cutting through a mountain pass. Then the thing threw itself into tearing apart the roof. We could hear it ripping away planks and shingles as if they were strips of wet bark. "The cellar," I shouted. Under the floorboards there was a small root cellar, used for storing roots and preserves. We rushed toward it, lifted the hatch, dropped ourselves inside, and bolted it from within just as the roof gave way above us. Through the cracks in the boards, we saw the lantern light tremble, dance for a few seconds, and then go out. After that, in total darkness, we heard it drop into the cabin. It did not sound like a heavy animal landing. It sounded like dry branches collapsing. Lying on the damp earth, breathing in a stench that was a mix of rot and electricity, we listened to it move above our heads. It was sniffing. It was a wet, vibrating, relentless sound, and it went on for a long time. It knew we were still there. Then it began scratching at the cellar hatch. Every scrape tore loose splinters. Darian held the rifle aimed at the little cellar door, his finger rigid on the trigger, but his hands were shaking so badly that the barrel knocked against the wood in a frantic rhythm. I had a flare clenched in my fist, grabbed in haste from my pack. I kept thinking only one thing. If that thing reached me, it would not have me in silence. When the first hinge began to give way, dawn arrived. The earliest touch of daylight barely reached the outside, and the scratching stopped immediately. Above us came a burst of frantic, desperate motion, almost like the savage wing beats of some monstrous bird trying to take flight. Then that dead, unbearable, unnatural silence returned. We waited a long time before we dared push the hatch open. When we finally climbed out, we found the cabin destroyed. The roof was completely gone. The chairs and table were reduced to fragments. The walls were coated in a thin film of transparent slime that gave off a sour smell, like oxidized copper. We did not collect anything. Not the packs, not the blankets, not even the coats that were still lying in plain sight. We ran. We took the trail back and stumbled through the snow, our lungs burning in the frozen air. Every time the wind pushed through the pines, all three of us flinched, convinced that that long, starving figure was about to emerge from the shadows. Several miles from the truck, we heard it. The same shriek, distant at first but closing fast. It was following us in full daylight, as if its hunger had finally overcome whatever revulsion it felt toward the sun. We reached the truck just as the entire forest fell silent again. Darian fumbled for the keys in panic and dropped them several times into the half-frozen mud. I turned toward the woods, facing them with the flare ready in my hand. Then it came out. Not too far from us, it emerged from the brush. It looked like skin stretched over an impossible skeleton. Its eyes, sunken into dark hollows, gave off a yellowish, sickly glow, faint but fixed. Its mouth was a slit packed with long, crowded teeth arranged like the uneven blades of an old saw. It did not come at us in a straight run. It advanced in leaps, covering an absurd amount of distance with every bound. Darian managed to start the engine just as the thing reached the edge of the clearing. I lit the flare and threw it. The red light burst out violently, spitting sparks and smoke as it landed near its feet. The creature recoiled at once and let out an electric hiss, like the furious buzz of a snapped power line. The brightness seemed to hurt those ancient eyes. I threw myself into the passenger seat while Darian slammed the truck into gear. The vehicle fishtailed down the forest road, with branches lashing the windows like desperate fingers. Through the mirror, I saw it one last time. It stood in the middle of the trail, upright and motionless, cut against the pale snow. It did not try to chase us anymore. It only watched us leave, its arms hanging far too low, past its knees, as if it had been made for a different gravity than ours. We did not slow down until we reached the main highway. We never reported any of it. What were we supposed to say? There was no way to tell the story without sounding insane. Since that night, I have never gone back into those woods, and for years now I have avoided any trip into the countryside after the first hard freeze. Many people insist that stories like these are nothing more than symbols invented to explain the brutality of winter and the way isolation damages the minds of men. I believed that myself for a very long time, but I know exactly what I heard. And I know the way that thing spoke my name in a voice that held nothing human inside it. There are presences in the deep woods that remain there because they must, and a person commits an act of real wisdom by leaving them alone, surrendered to that endless appetite that should never, under any circumstances, be awakened.